There is a story that many people have heard, repeated so often that it almost feels like a fact. It is told in different ways, across cultures, videos, and conversations, until it settles quietly in the mind as something unquestionable. The story claims that Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, a king unlike any other, controlled the jinn through a mysterious ring, a ring that held power, a ring that commanded the unseen, and a ring that made the impossible seem ordinary. But pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever wondered where this story actually comes from? Or have you simply accepted it because it sounds fascinating, powerful, and easy to believe? Because the truth is, when something is repeated enough times, it stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like reality. This is how ideas quietly enter our beliefs without us even noticing. A detail here, a story there, and suddenly something that was never part of authentic teachings begins to feel like it belongs. And when it comes to matters of faith, this is not something small. Because what you believe about the unseen, about power and about the prophets, shapes how you understand your relationship with Allah. Now think about this carefully. If a simple object like a ring truly held such power, if control over jinn came from something physical, then what does that say about the nature of power itself? Does it come from objects, from hidden tools, from something you can hold in your hand? Or does it come from somewhere far greater, far beyond human imagination? This is where the story begins to shift. Because Islam does not teach us to look at objects for power. It teaches us to look at the one who created everything. Yet the idea of a ring gives a different impression. It quietly suggests that power can be contained, controlled, and even owned through something material. And that is where the danger begins, not in the story itself, but in what it makes you believe. The more you think about it, the more you realize how appealing this idea is. A powerful ring, a hidden secret, control over unseen beings. It feels like something out of a legend, and that is exactly why it spreads so easily. Because the human mind is naturally drawn to mystery, to power, and to things that feel extraordinary. But here is something most people never stop to consider. Just because a story is popular does not make it true. And just because something sounds powerful does not mean it aligns with the truth that Allah has revealed. In fact, sometimes the most widely believed ideas are the ones that need to be questioned the most. So now you are standing at a point of decision. You can continue accepting what you have always heard, or you can take a step back and ask a deeper question. What is the actual truth behind this story? Did Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam really control the jinn through a ring? Or is there something far more profound that most people have completely overlooked? Because what you are about to discover is not just a correction of a story, it is a shift in understanding power itself. And once you see it clearly, the difference between myth and truth becomes impossible to ignore. If this story is not clearly found in authentic Islamic teachings, then the question becomes unavoidable. Where did it actually come from? Because ideas do not appear out of nowhere. They travel, they evolve, and sometimes they quietly attach themselves to truth until the line between the two becomes blurred. The idea of a powerful ring controlling unseen forces is not new. In fact, it appears in many ancient cultures long before people began associating it with Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam. Stories of kings, magicians, and mystical figures using rings to command spirits have existed in folklore for centuries. These were tales designed to entertain, to create wonder, and to give people a sense of hidden power in a world they could not fully understand. Over time, as different cultures interacted, traded ideas, and shared stories, some of these narratives began to mix with religious concepts. Slowly, without clear boundaries, elements of myth started attaching themselves to real figures. And because Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam was already known in Islam as a king with authority over the jinn, it became easy for people to connect the two. A powerful prophet and a powerful object. The combination felt natural, even though it had no authentic foundation. This is how distortion often begins, not through obvious falsehood, but through subtle additions that feel believable. A detail is added, a story is retold, and eventually it becomes so familiar that no one stops to question it anymore. And when something reaches that level of familiarity, it becomes dangerous because it bypasses critical thinking completely. Now reflect on this carefully. If a story is repeated in books, videos, and conversations, your mind starts to accept it automatically. You no longer ask, "Is this true?" Instead, you assume, "This must be true." And that shift is powerful, because belief once formed is not easily challenged. But Islam teaches something very different. It teaches you to return to authentic sources, to question what you hear, and to separate truth from assumption, because not everything that is widely known is actually correct, and not everything that sounds convincing comes from revelation. This is where the contrast becomes clear. On one side, you have human imagination, stories shaped by curiosity, mystery, and the desire for power. On the other side, you have divine revelation, clear, precise, and protected from distortion. One is built on speculation, the other on truth. Yet when the two are mixed, they can look almost identical to the untrained eye. And this is not just about one story. It is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Small additions, small changes, and slowly the original message becomes surrounded by layers that were never meant to be part of it. The danger is not just believing something incorrect. The danger is becoming comfortable with not knowing the difference. So now the question becomes personal again. How many things do you believe today simply because you have heard them many times? How many ideas have entered your understanding without ever being verified? Because once you begin to question one widely accepted belief, it opens the door to a deeper level of awareness. And this is where the journey begins to change. Because now, instead of accepting the story, you are searching for its truth. And once you take that step, you are ready to move beyond myths and return to what actually matters. Because when it comes to Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, the reality of his power is far greater than any story people have created. And what the Quran reveals is not only more accurate, but far more powerful than anything the imagination could produce. Now that the layers of myth have been peeled back, what remains is a question that carries far more weight than the story itself. If Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam did not control the jinn through a ring, then how did he have such extraordinary power? Because there is no doubt that his authority was real. The Quran itself confirms that he was given a kingdom unlike any other. So the answer is not that his power was imaginary, but that its source was completely different from what many people assume. The Quran makes something very clear, again and again, in ways that leave no room for confusion. The power of Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam did not come from an object, a tool, or anything he possessed physically. It came directly from Allah. It was a gift, a miracle, and at the same time a test. Allah granted him authority over things that no other human being has ever been given. The wind obeyed his command. The jinn worked under his authority. Even animals were part of his kingdom in a way that no king before or after experienced. But here is the part that changes everything. This power was never independent. It was never something Sulaiman alayhi salam owned or controlled on his own. It was always tied to the permission of Allah. Without that permission, none of it would exist. And this is the difference that many people overlook, because when you attach power to an object, you begin to believe that the object holds control. But when you understand that power comes only from Allah, you realize that everything else is simply a means, not a source. Think about the contrast for a moment. A ring suggests something small, something limited, something that can be held, lost, or taken. But the power granted by Allah is not confined in that way. It is limitless, beyond human control, and completely dependent on divine will. This shifts the entire perspective. Instead of focusing on how power is controlled, you begin to understand who truly controls it. The Quran also makes a clear distinction between miracles and magic. Magic is associated with illusion, deception, and forces that mislead people away from truth. It creates the appearance of control, but ultimately leads to confusion. The miracles given to prophets, on the other hand, are signs from Allah. They are not meant to entertain or create mystery, but to guide people toward belief and understanding. The authority of Sulaiman alayhi salam was never about showing dominance for its own sake. It was about demonstrating the power of Allah in a way that people could witness and reflect upon. This is why his story is so powerful. Not because he controlled the jinn, but because he did so while fully submitting to Allah. Despite having authority that no one else had, he never allowed it to change his understanding of who was truly in control. He did not become arrogant. He did not rely on his power. Instead, he remained aware that everything he had was a trust from Allah. And that awareness is what made his story meaningful. Now reflect on your own perspective for a moment. When you think about power, success, or control in your life, where do you believe it comes from? Is it from your efforts, your possessions, your strategies? Or do you recognize that everything ultimately comes from Allah? Because this is not just a historical discussion, it is a reflection of how you understand your own reality. The story of Sulaiman alayhi salam is not meant to make you imagine a king with supernatural abilities. It is meant to remind you that even the greatest power in this world is nothing without the permission of Allah. And when you truly understand that, it changes the way you see everything around you. But even with this understanding, there is still more to uncover. Because the way Sulaiman alayhi salam used this power, the way he lived with it, reveals something even deeper. And this is where the story moves beyond explanation and begins to show its real lesson. Imagine for a moment a kingdom where the rules of the world itself seem to bend. Not in chaos, not in disorder, but in perfect obedience to a command that was granted by Allah alone. This was not an ordinary kingdom built on armies, wealth, or fear. This was the kingdom of Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, a kingdom where the wind carried him across vast distances, where animals communicated in ways humans could not understand, and where the jinn worked under his command with precision and discipline. But even as you imagine this, pause and reflect. This was not power in the way humans usually understand it. It was not about domination for pride or control for personal gain. It was something far more structured, far more purposeful, because every part of this kingdom operated under a system that pointed back to one truth. Everything existed by the will of Allah, and everything functioned within that boundary. The jinn, beings created from smokeless fire, were part of this system. They were not free to act as they pleased under Suleiman's authority. They were assigned tasks, building structures, diving into the depths, and carrying out work that no human could accomplish. Yet even they were bound by limits. Their obedience was not to Sulaiman alayhi salam as an independent ruler, but to the command that Allah had placed upon them through him. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything, because it shows that even in a kingdom filled with extraordinary power, the source of control was never human. Now consider the contrast. On one side, you have a king with unmatched authority, able to command forces beyond human reach. On the other side, you have that same king standing in humility, fully aware that none of this belongs to him. This is what makes the story remarkable, because power often changes people. It creates arrogance, distance, and a sense of superiority. But in the case of Sulaiman alayhi salam, it did the opposite. It deepened his gratitude, strengthened his submission, and kept his heart connected to Allah. There are moments in his story that reflect this clearly. When he witnessed the blessings given to him, he did not take credit. He did not say, "This is mine." Instead, his response reflected awareness. He recognized that what he had was a test, a responsibility, and a trust. And that mindset is something most people overlook when they focus only on the idea of power itself. Because the real story is not about what he controlled. It is about how he remained controlled in his actions, his intentions, and his understanding of his place before Allah. This is what separates a prophet from a king. A king may rule over people, but a prophet remains a servant, no matter how much authority he is given. Now bring this back to your own understanding. When you think about control, what do you imagine? Do you think of having influence, authority, or the ability to shape outcomes? Because in reality, control is often an illusion. People chase it, believing that if they can just gain enough of it, they will feel secure. But the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam shows something different. It shows that even when control is given at the highest level, it is still not yours. It is entrusted to you, and it can be taken away just as easily. This is where the deeper lesson begins to emerge. The kingdom of Sulaiman alayhi salam was not just a display of power. It was a reminder that everything in this world, no matter how al-azim it appears, is temporary and dependent. And the one who understands this does not become attached to power. Instead, they become aware of its purpose. And yet, despite how clear this reality is, many people still focus on the surface of the story. They look at the power, the control, the extraordinary elements, and they miss what it is pointing toward. Because the story is not inviting you to admire power. It is inviting you to understand it. And once you begin to understand it, another question naturally arises. If even a prophet with such immense authority remained humble and aware, then what happens when ordinary people misunderstand the source of power altogether? Because this is where the real danger begins to reveal itself. At first glance, the idea of a ring controlling the jinn may seem harmless. It feels like just another story, something interesting, something easy to ignore. But when you look deeper, you begin to realize that it is not as simple as it appears. Because the problem is not just the story itself. The problem is what the story slowly teaches you to believe without you even noticing. When power is linked to an object even subtly, it shifts your understanding of where control truly comes from. Instead of seeing everything as dependent on Allah, the mind begins to accept the idea that power can be contained within something created. A ring, a symbol, a tool. And once that idea settles in, it becomes easier to accept other forms of misunderstanding as well. This is how small distortions can grow into larger ones over time. Think about the contrast here. On one side, you have the concept of Tawheed, the belief that all power belongs to Allah alone, that nothing happens without His will, and that no created thing holds independent authority. On the other side, you have the idea that an object can control unseen forces. Even if someone does not consciously believe it, the suggestion itself weakens the clarity of that understanding. And that is where the real danger lies. Because beliefs are not always shaped by what you openly declare. They are shaped by what you repeatedly accept without questioning. A story heard once may not affect you, but a story heard again and again begins to settle deeper until it feels normal. And when something feels normal, it no longer feels necessary to question it. Now bring this back to your own life. How many times have you looked for solutions in things that are visible, immediate, and tangible, while forgetting the one who controls everything behind the scenes? How often do people place their trust in systems, objects, or even other people, believing that these things hold the power to change their situation? This is not very different from the mindset that a story like this can slowly create. And this is why Islam constantly brings your focus back to Allah, not just in moments of worship, but in your understanding of cause and effect. Yes, there are means in this world. There are actions you take, choices you make, and tools you use. But none of them hold power on their own. They only work because Allah allows them to. Remove that permission, and they become nothing. The danger of myths like this is that they blur that distinction. They make it seem as if power can be owned, controlled, or accessed through something other than Allah's will. And once that line is blurred, even slightly, it becomes easier for a person to drift without realizing it, not in a dramatic way, not in an obvious way, but slowly, quietly, and over time. This is how misunderstandings affect people, not through sudden change, but through gradual influence. A belief here, an assumption there, until the foundation is no longer as strong as it once was. And when it comes to matters of faith, even small shifts in understanding can have deep consequences. But here is something important to remember. Recognizing this does not mean you have done something wrong. It means you are becoming aware. And awareness is the first step toward clarity. Because once you begin to question what you have accepted, you open the door to understanding what is actually true. So now, the story is no longer just about a ring or a myth. It becomes a reflection of something much bigger. It becomes a reminder to examine what you believe, to understand where your trust lies, and to realign your perspective with what is Haqiqi. And when you begin to see it this way, you realize that this is not just about correcting a misunderstanding. It is about strengthening something much more important: your connection to Allah, your understanding of His power, and your awareness of where true control really exists. Because once that becomes clear, everything else begins to fall into place. Now step back for a moment and look at everything you have understood so far. A story that once felt simple has now revealed something much deeper. It was never really about a ring or even about the Jinn. It was about how you understand power, where you believe control comes from, and how that belief quietly shapes the way you live your life every single day. Because if you truly reflect, you will notice something. People are constantly searching for control over their al-mustaqbal, their risk, their problems, their fears. They look for ways to manage uncertainty, to secure outcomes, to feel safe in a world that is constantly changing. And in that search, it becomes very easy to attach your hope to things that feel immediate and tangible. A plan, a person, an opportunity, or even an object. But this is where the contrast becomes clear. Everything in this dunya feels close, visible, and within reach. You can see it, touch it, and interact with it. It gives the illusion that you are in control. Yet, the reality of the Akhirah and the reality of Allah's power is unseen. It requires trust, belief, and awareness. And for many people, that is harder, because the unseen demands certainty without physical proof, while the dunya offers comfort through visibility. This is exactly why stories like the one you have just explored can be so misleading. They quietly pull your focus towards something you can imagine holding, instead of reminding you of the one who holds everything. And once that shift happens, even slightly, it affects how you make decisions, how you deal with challenges, and how you understand success and failure. Now ask yourself honestly, when something goes wrong in your life, where does your mind go first? Do you immediately turn to Allah with certainty, knowing that He controls every outcome? Or do you first look at the situation, the people, the circumstances, trying to figure out how to fix it on your own? This question is not meant to make you feel guilty. It is meant to make you aware, because awareness is what brings change. The story of Sulaiman alayhi salam teaches you something powerful, but only if you look beyond the surface. He had more control than any human being could ever imagine, yet he never relied on that control. He never saw it as his own. Instead, he remained connected to the source of it all, and that is the lesson most people miss. Because in reality, you're not being asked to control anything extraordinary. You're simply being asked to trust the one who already controls everything. And that shift in mindset changes everything. It removes the pressure of trying to manage every outcome. It replaces fear with reliance. It replaces confusion with clarity. But this does not mean you stop taking action. It means you understand the role of your actions. You do what you can, but your heart remains attached to Allah. You plan, but you know the result is not in your hands. You try, but you understand that success comes only if He allows it. This balance is what creates peace, even in uncertainty. And this is where the real transformation begins. Not when you learn a new story, but when your perspective changes. When you stop looking for control in the wrong places and start recognizing where it truly belongs. Because once you understand that, you begin to live differently. You worry less about what you cannot control, and you focus more on what you can do sincerely. So as you leave this reflection, do not just think about whether the story of the ring is true or false. Think about what it has revealed to you. Think about where your trust lies, where your focus goes, and how you understand the power that shapes your life. Because in the end, the real secret was never hidden in a ring. It was always in something far greater. And once you see it clearly, it becomes something you carry, not in your hand, but in your heart.